The pen in Admiral Greer's hand trembled once before it touched the page. 14 times humanity had signed away something it could not afford to lose. The Cascara Accords were the latest. The chamber was enormous, built by the Keth Dominion specifically to make other species feel small. 40 meters of black stone rose above our heads. Cold blue lights buzzed at a frequency humans found uncomfortable. I think that was intentional. The Keth were always intentional. Admiral Paul Greer sat to my left, 61 years old, 30 of those years in uniform. He held his pen like it was a weapon and still his hand trembled. He locked it down through what I could only imagine was 40 years of practice discipline. He signed. He set the pen down. He did not look up. To my right sat Ambassador Grace Hollies. She had negotiated 6 of the 14 accords, the best diplomat humanity had ever produced. She had spent 3 weeks in closed sessions fighting for every comma, every margin, every clause. She won some of them. She signed anyway. Her expression was the one I knew best from her, the expression of someone swallowing something that had no intention of going down quietly. I was there as a witness. Commander Sarah Voss, attached to Earth Joint Command, present by official order, contributing nothing except my signature at the bottom of page 11. 34 years old. I had been told this was an honor. On the other side of the table, the Keth delegation did not bother hiding their satisfaction. First Speaker Gareth Soule watched us the way a landlord watches a tenant finally paying overdue rent. He did not celebrate. He did not need to. The Keth had learned long ago that they did not need to celebrate. They just needed to wait. The Accords gave them 3 things. Reduction of the human colonial fleet by 30% over 18 months. Formal recognition of Keth authority over the Verith corridor. A stretch of space that included 4 human-settled systems. And a new inspection clause granting Conclave representatives the right to board and audit any human vessel operating within 100 light-years of Keth space. In exchange, we received a formal apology for what had happened on Verith 4, worded so carefully that it managed to acknowledge nothing. We received extended trade licenses that came with fees that would cost us more than the licenses were worth. And we received what Grace Hollies had fought hardest for, a guarantee that no further human colonies would be displaced without 60 days' notice, and a resettlement fund. 60 days. As if 60 days was enough time to uproot a life. My brother Owen had been given 48 hours. He was 29 when the Keth Relay Station project was announced. Living on Verith 4 with his partner and their daughter in a settlement built over 12 years by 300 families who had traveled 11 light-years to start something new. He was a structural engineer. He built water recycling systems, the kind of work that does not sound important until you realize that without it, people die of thirst. Owen called me when the notice went out. I was aboard a patrol frigate near the edge of the Keth system, running a routine scan that turned up nothing, as all my routine scans in those years turned up nothing. He was not panicking. That was what I remember most. He described what was happening in the same even voice he used for everything, the voice of a man who had been raised to believe that steady handling was the answer to any crisis. They had been told to gather what they could carry. Resettlement transports were arriving in 46 hours. The relay station construction teams were already on the ground on the other side of the settlement, and the equipment they were using was loud enough that Owen could hear it through the walls of his house. He told me his daughter had asked him where they were going. He told me he had not known what to say. I told him it would be sorted out. I told him these things always got sorted out. I told him to stay calm, stay cooperative, and I would make some calls. I made the calls. Every single one went nowhere. The Conclave had approved the station. The Keth had rights to the corridor under the 9th Accord. The displacement was legal. The settlement fund would cover relocation costs. Was there anything else I could help with? 3 weeks later, Owen was dead. Not from anything dramatic. Not from violence or sabotage or a Keth weapon. He died because the resettlement transport his family was placed on had a faulty atmospheric processor in the cargo section, and no one had checked it before loading. By the time anyone noticed the readings were wrong, 3 people in the back of the hold had already lost consciousness. Owen crawled back through the dark to carry them forward, one at a time, to where the air was still good. He made 2 trips. He did not make the third. The conclave issued a statement, a formal inquiry. The transport company, a Keth-contracted logistics firm, paid a fine that amounted to roughly the cost of 1 replacement atmospheric unit. The settlement fund sent my family a compensation credit. I accepted it. I have asked myself why many times, and I always arrive at the same answer. I accepted it because I did not yet believe that refusing would change anything. I was still inside the frame that the conclave had built for us. The frame that told us the correct response to injustice was a formal objection through proper channels, and that the proper channels, given enough time and pressure, would produce something resembling justice. I was wrong. I know that now. I knew it then, somewhere underneath everything. But I had not yet found the part of myself willing to act on it. That came later. The session in the Cascara chamber ended with a reception. Drinks were served, the kind that humans could consume but did not particularly enjoy, because the conclave catered events based on the preferences of the majority of attendees, and humans were not the majority. I stood near the edge of the room with a glass of something faintly blue and watched Gareth Soul move through the space with his attendants, accepting small bows from other species, the way a sun accepts the orbit of planets, simply the natural order. Grace Hollies found me near the exit. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. She had known me for 6 years. She knew about Owen. She had personally written the 60-day notice clause with his name in the back of her mind, and she had not been able to get it below 60, and that had cost her something I never asked her about directly. "Go home," she said. "Rest." "Yes, Ambassador." She put her hand briefly on my arm. Then she walked back into the room, because Grace Hollies did not get to leave early. Grace Hollies was always the last human out of every room. I took a transport back to my ship that night. A small vessel, a recon cruiser. Nothing impressive. 12 crew and enough firepower to discourage pirates and not much else. I walked straight through to the forward hull section, the narrow corridor that ran along the nose of the ship where you could look out through reinforced panels and see stars without any filter or frame between you and them. I stood there for a long time. I thought about Owen. I thought about his daughter, who was 6 now and living with my mother on a settlement 2 systems over, and who had started asking questions that none of us had good answers to. I thought about the pen shaking in Admiral Greer's hand. I thought about the 60-day clause and the compensation credit and the fine that cost less than a replacement part. I thought about all 14 accords, each one a step backward, each one signed with steady hands and careful language, and the quiet hope that this one would be the last. And then, standing in the dark of that corridor with the stars laid out ahead of me, I felt something shift. It was not anger exactly. Anger is hot. What I felt was colder than that, slower, more deliberate. It was the feeling of a door closing somewhere inside me. Not on hope, not entirely, but on a particular kind of hope. The kind that waits for someone else to fix it. That was the day I stopped being afraid of what they might do. I started thinking about what we could. I did not know yet, standing in that corridor, that I was not the only one. I did not know that across 14 human-controlled systems, in the bellies of mining rigs, on the floors of fabrication plants, in the back rooms of colony administration offices, other people had been feeling the same cold shift for years longer than I had. I did not know that someone had already given that feeling a name, a structure, and a plan. I did not know about Protocol Ember. Not yet, but I was about to find out. When I think back to the moment I first heard the name, I remember the lighting more than anything else. It was a maintenance bay on Elian Station, one of those spaces that stations accumulate the way old houses accumulate rooms nobody uses anymore. A former equipment storage area that had been reclassified twice and now existed in administrative limbo, unlisted in the station directory, powered by a secondary grid that the automated systems rarely flagged. I was there because Chief Engineer Ned Calloway had asked me to come. Ned was the kind of person who existed at the edge of every official record. He had been with Earth Joint Command for 22 years. His service file was thoroughly unimpressive. A string of postings to secondary installations. a handful of commendations buried under a larger handful of formal notations for independent decision-making and procedural deviation. His superiors had considered him a capable but difficult engineer who was never quite where the regulations expected him to be. His actual superiors, the ones whose names did not appear on any organizational chart, considered him indispensable. He was waiting for me in the maintenance bay with two other people I had never met. The first was a woman named Carol Finch, a logistics coordinator attached to the Verith Corridor Resettlement Program, which meant she had spent the last 4 years moving human families out of their homes and into temporary housing, cataloging every displaced person, every lost belonging, every community dissolved by a Keth land order. She had the look of someone who had been doing difficult work in silence for a very long time. Her handshake was brief and firm. She looked at me the way people look at someone they have already decided to trust before meeting them. The second was a man named Roy Hatch, harder to place, mid-40s, civilian clothes, the kind of face that did not announce anything about itself. No obvious connection to the military or the colonial administration. He turned out to be a communications engineer who had spent 15 years working with Fold space relay networks, the systems the Conclave used to transmit signals across star systems. And he knew those systems the way Ned knew engines. From the inside, from the parts nobody else thought about. Ned poured 4 cups of coffee from a thermos he had brought himself. He did not ask how I took it. He handed me a cup and said, "You signed the Cascara Accords 3 days ago." "I witnessed them," I said. "Right," he said. "And before that, you spent 6 years following orders that led to 14 of those things." I looked at him. "I'm not saying that to make you feel bad," he said. "I'm saying it because I need to know where your head is now, not 3 years ago." "Now, my head," I said, "is in the same place as my hand 3 days ago. Neither of them has anywhere left to go." Ned nodded. He sat down on a cable spool and looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Have you ever heard of Protocol Ember?" I had not. What he told me over the next 2 hours rearranged everything. I thought I knew about the last 4 decades of human history. Protocol Ember had been conceived 41 years earlier, in the immediate aftermath of the Heron incident, the first major humiliation, the one that the history files described as a diplomatic misunderstanding, and that anyone who had actually been there described as something else entirely. A human survey vessel had entered a region of space that the Conclave had not yet formally claimed. No published boundary placed it off limits. A Keth patrol fleet intercepted it, stripped its navigation systems, and returned it to human space with a formal Conclave notice that the region was now under Keth jurisdiction retroactively, effective from the date of the incident, and that the human vessel had therefore been in violation of Keth territorial law. The Conclave upheld it. Earth filed a protest. The protest was acknowledged and set aside. In the weeks that followed, a group of 12 people inside Earth Joint Command had a series of conversations that never entered any official record. Senior officers mostly, but also 2 engineers, a logistics specialist, and a civilian economist named Arthur Slade, who had spent years studying conclave trade structures and had come to conclusions that made everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. Their central question was simple. If the diplomatic path had a ceiling, what was the alternative? Their central answer, arrived at after a great deal of argument, was also simple. Preparation, not aggression, not provocation, not anything that would give the conclave legal justification to move against humanity. Just preparation. Quiet, patient, distributed, deniable preparation for the day the ceiling became a floor. They called it ember, the idea being that an ember does not look dangerous. It is dim, nearly invisible, easily overlooked, but it holds heat, and given the right conditions it does not stay an ember. The structure they built was the thing that stunned me most when Ned explained it. There was no central command, no dedicated facility, no uniform branch, no budget line that anyone could find and trace back to a single source. Protocol Ember was embedded inside everything. Mining operations throughout human-controlled space were equipped with modular hardpoints, standard structural brackets by their official specification. Brackets that could be fitted with rail acceleration systems in under 6 hours by a crew that knew what they were doing. The ships were already pre-stressed to handle the recoil. The crew manuals contained what looked like standard maintenance procedures. To the trained eye, they were assembly instructions. Cargo freighters had fold-capable hulls, not fold drives. Those were the one piece of conclave technology that humanity had never been permitted to independently develop. But the hulls were built to handle the stress of fold transit without the structural failures that would otherwise make retrofitting a drive impossible. When the drives became available, the hulls would be ready. Colony administration offices maintained sealed equipment caches, registered as emergency disaster response stores. Terraforming drone fleets operated on software that included locked secondary instruction sets, accessible only by a specific coded input sequence. Long-range sensor arrays on the edges of human space doubled as targeting networks. None of it individually was illegal. None of it individually looked like anything other than what it claimed to be. The Conclave's inspection teams had passed over human installations hundreds of times in 40 years and found no violations, because there were no violations to find. Only a vast, patient system of preparation that was hiding not in secret bunkers, but in plain sight, distributed across the ordinary machinery of human civilization. By the time I sat in that maintenance bay listening to Ned Calloway explain it, the system had been building and refining itself for 41 years. There were 4,400 Ember-class warships hidden in asteroid belts and deep space caches. 800 stealth frigates parked in fold space at coordinates held by Ember cell coordinators. People like Ned, people like Carol, scattered across every human system. 22 mining arrays that were not mining arrays. I sat very still for a long time after he finished. "Who knows about this?" I asked. "Officially nobody," Ned said. "Practically, a lot of people, more than you'd think, ordinary people. Mostly ordinary people," Carol said. It was the first thing she had said in 20 minutes. "Officers helped design it, but it's the engineers, the miners, the cargo pilots, the colony administrators who built it and maintained it and kept their mouths shut about it for 4 decades. Nobody asked most of them to do it. They understood what was at stake. They did it anyway. That stopped me, not because it was surprising, exactly, but because it confirmed something I had been slowly arriving at without being able to name it. Humanity had not needed to be organized into resistance. It had organized itself. The instinct for it had simply been there, dormant in ordinary people going about ordinary work. And someone 40 years ago had been smart enough to build a structure around that instinct instead of trying to manufacture it from above. Roy Hatch spoke for the first time in a while. "The Keth announced this morning that they're sending an inspection fleet to Earth," he said. "Compliance check on the Cascara disarmament clause. They want to begin confirming fleet reductions within 60 days. 60 days. There was that number again. "And when they get here," I said, "they'll find 12 outdated destroyers and a lot of civilian traffic," Ned said. "And they'll file a glowing compliance report." "That's right. I thought about it. And then they'll feel safe enough to move to the next step." Ned looked at me steadily. "The Conclave announced this morning, 3 hours after the inspection fleet news, that Phase 2 of the Cascara implementation will involve permanent observers on every human world, not rotating, permanent, with authority to flag any military or dual-use development for Conclave review." The room was quiet. "Observers," Carol said, in the same tone you would use if someone had replaced a familiar word with something worse. "That's what they're calling them," Roy said. I looked at my coffee. It had gone cold. I drank it anyway. I thought about what Ned had said. 41 years, 4,400 ships, 22 mining arrays that were not mining arrays. A population that had quietly, patiently, without fanfare or speeches, spent 4 decades preparing for a morning that might never come, and had done it not out of hatred or a desire for violence, but out of the oldest, deepest human understanding, that you do not leave yourself with no options. Ned was watching me. "Tell me what you need from me," I said. He reached into his jacket and put a small device on the table between us. A standard-looking personal communicator, Nothing distinctive about it. When this lights up, he said, it means the word has gone out. Every ember cell in every human system will receive the same signal within 90 seconds of each other. What happens after that depends on the people in those cells. And what am I? He looked at me steadily. You're a cell coordinator. You have been for 3 years. You just didn't know it yet. I looked at the communicator. How many people don't know it yet? I asked. Fewer than you'd think, he said. I picked it up. It was lighter than I expected. Or maybe I had expected everything to feel heavier than it did, now that the frame had finally broken, and something real was sitting in its place. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, from the strange, almost physical sensation of having made a decision that had actually already been made, of catching up to a version of yourself that had been waiting patiently for a very long time for you to arrive. At 400 station time, my communicator lit up. I was not asleep. I had not been asleep for 2 hours. I was sitting at the small desk in my quarters with a glass of water and a blank page I had been intending to write something on and had not. When the light came on, I did not feel surprised. I felt something closer to recognition, the way you feel when a name you have been trying to remember finally surfaces. I had 12 minutes to reach my ship. I made it in 8. The bridge of a recon cruiser is not a dramatic space. It is small, efficient, built for function rather than appearance. 6 stations arranged in a shallow arc. A forward view that is more useful than beautiful. My crew was already at their posts. They had received the same signal I had through channels I had established quietly over the previous 3 years during cargo runs and patrol rotations that had always looked like exactly what they were labeled. Routine operations, nothing worth noting. They looked at me when I came in. Not for orders. They already knew what was happening. They looked at me the way people look at someone they have been waiting to stand next to for a long time. Pilot Owen Hart brought the ship to full readiness without being asked. I had requested him specifically for my crew 2 years earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with his last name and everything to do with his extraordinary spatial awareness and his absolute calm under pressure. Engineer Dana Wells was already running diagnostic checks on systems that had been carrying hidden capabilities for 4 years and had never once been used. Communications officer Pete Larkin was watching the feed from Earth with an expression of focused quiet. We were one ship, but we were not alone. At 4:12, I brought up the tactical display and watched it populate. In the asteroid belt beyond Mars, things were moving, not dramatically. No explosions, no sudden appearances, just a slow, deliberate emergence, the way shapes appear in fog when you finally look directly at them. Ships that had been registered as mining platforms were retracting their drilling equipment and extending something else. Long-range sensor contacts that had been cataloged as debris fields were resolving into vessels. From the outer edge of the system, where the light was thin and the traffic monitoring systems had the worst resolution, entire fleets were orienting themselves. I had known the numbers. Knowing the numbers and watching the display were different experiences. Pete Larkin looked up from his station. Keth Inspection Fleet is hailing us. They want to know why we're at full power. Don't answer, I said. He nodded. How long until they have a complete picture of what's in this system? I asked. Dana answered from engineering. At their scanning resolution at current range. 40 minutes for a full sweep. But the moment we start moving, they'll have a partial picture in about 3. I looked at the display. The Keth Inspection Fleet was composed of 9 vessels, heavy cruisers, well-armed, configured for compliance operations rather than combat. They were sitting in a comfortable holding position about 200 kilometers off our port bow, between us and nothing in particular. They had come here expecting to spend 6 weeks auditing fleet manifests and signing off on decommissioning certificates. Pete, I said, open a channel to the inspection fleet. He opened it. The Keth duty officer appeared on my screen, young by Keth standards, which meant he had probably been doing this for 30 years. He looked mildly irritated, the way officials look when something is slightly off schedule but not yet alarming. Commander Voss, he said, your vessel is at combat readiness. This is inconsistent with the Cascara compliance posture. Please stand down. I am going to give you 3 seconds, I said, to signal your fleet to begin withdrawing from this system. I am not going to explain why. I am not going to negotiate the terms. I am giving you the option because I believe it is the right thing to do. He stared at me. I counted to 3. He had not signaled. I looked at Owen Hart. Bring us to intercept. What happened in the next 4 minutes was over before the Keth duty officer had finished transmitting his emergency alert to the conclave. A targeted disabling strike. Not destruction. Not casualties. The inspection fleet's propulsion and communication systems went offline. They were not going anywhere. They were not telling anyone anything. Not yet. They were sitting in space, intact and alive, staring at a tactical display that had just told them something their files had explicitly said was impossible. Across the system, the same thing was happening to every conclave vessel within human space. At 4:28, Pete Larkin brought up the conclave emergency frequency. The signal from Earth's Shadow Council had gone out 20 minutes earlier. Every ember cell in every human system had activated simultaneously. Not one deviation. Not one cell had failed to respond. Not one ship had gone to the wrong coordinates. 41 years of preparation had produced something that most military planners consider theoretically impossible. A perfectly coordinated multi-system operation with no central command in the field. The conclave frequency was chaos. I listened to it for a moment. Voices in 6 alien languages, overlapping, urgent. Someone was demanding a status report from the Verith corridor. Someone else was trying to reach the Observer Deployment Command and getting silence. A senior Keth official was issuing orders that nobody was acknowledging, because the systems those orders were traveling through had been taken offline 3 minutes earlier by Roy Hatch and his team, working from a relay node on the edge of Keth space that they had spent 4 years mapping. "Commander," Pete said quietly, "we have confirmation from all 41 systems. Green across the board." I let out a breath. Dana looked up from her station. "What do we do with the inspection fleet?" "We wait," I said. "They'll make contact when they're ready to talk." She nodded. I looked at the forward view. The stars were the same. They were always the same, indifferent to everything happening in the dark between them. But the space they lit felt different now. Less like a map of places we were permitted to go. More like what it actually was. At 4:51, the Keth Inspection Fleet Commander transmitted a direct hail. Not the duty officer this time. The fleet commander himself, a senior officer whose name I recognized from conclave engagement reports. He did not look angry. He looked like a man reassessing a mathematical problem he had believed was solved. "Commander Voss," he said carefully, "we would like to understand what is happening." Behind me, Owen Hart made a quiet sound. Not a laugh. Something smaller than that. The exhale of someone who had been holding their breath for a very long time. "That's the right question," I said. "Let me explain it to you. Humanity was no longer asking for its rights. Humanity was no longer submitting to inspections of systems it had built with its own hands. In space it had earned with its own effort. Humanity was no longer signing accords that were dressed as agreements and functioned as instructions. What I did not explain, because some things are better shown than spoken, was that even as we were talking, 3 Keth military shipyard facilities in the outer systems were being removed from operation. Not the trade hubs. Not the residential stations. Not anything that housed civilians. Specifically, precisely, the yards that had produced the vessels used in the Verith 4 operation. Carol Finch had identified them. Roy Hatch had confirmed the coordinates. Dana Wells had handled the targeting solution with a precision that had taken her 3 years to develop and 12 seconds to execute. The Keth fleet commander listened. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The way a door closes when the person on the other side finally understands that the conversation they thought they were having is not the conversation happening. "You cannot do this," he said. "We just did," I said. The conclave sent a formal communication at 600. The Arathi Grand Admiral herself. Her voice was stern, measured, clearly practiced. She demanded that humanity stand down and submit to a conclave tribunal. She cited the Cascara Accords, the inspection protocols, the legal framework that had governed galactic relations for 200 years. I read it aloud to the bridge crew. Pete Larkin put his face in his hands. Not from distress, from the particular exhaustion of a man who has spent years watching powerful institutions fail to understand that the moment had passed them by. They still think we're asking, Dana said. They'll learn, I said. At 800, Earth's formal communication went out on all conclave frequencies, 22 sentences long. It laid out humanity's position, its demands, and its terms for ceasing active operations. It was the first document in 40 years of galactic diplomacy that humanity had written entirely on its own terms. No committee review, no conclave mediator, no eye toward what the other side would find acceptable. 22 sentences. The conclave emergency session convened at 8:30. I received a live feed through a frequency we had kept open for exactly this purpose. The session chamber was a large, imposing space that I had seen in broadcast footage a dozen times. Rows of alien delegates arranged by species. A presiding council at the front. The kind of room designed to make the people inside it feel that whatever was being decided there was the center of the universe. The room was not calm. The Arathi military analyst was at the front, working through a tactical summary. I could see the display from the feed. It showed the human fleet positions across 41 systems, not an estimate, an actual confirmed count compiled from the last 90 minutes of sensor data. She stopped mid-sentence. She looked at the display. She looked at the presiding council. Their fleet strength is. She paused. The kind of pause that in any language means the speaker has encountered a number that does not fit the container they prepared for it. This cannot be correct. This is not the species in our files. I saved that recording. I have kept it for 3 years. I have listened to it many times not out of satisfaction, though I will not pretend satisfaction was entirely absent. But because that sentence contained something true and important, they had a file on us. They had studied us, cataloged us, built models of what we were capable of, and they had been confident enough in those models to structure an entire policy architecture around them. They had read the file. They had not read the people. At 900, I received confirmation I had been waiting for since the moment the communicator lit up at 400. Varith 4 was in human hands. A landing force of 400 people had touched down on the surface 40 minutes earlier. The Keth garrison had been small. The facility was a relay station, not a military installation, and the Keth had never felt the need to defend it heavily, because it had never occurred to them that it needed defending. The garrison surrendered without significant resistance. The station itself was intact, in the center of where the settlement had once been, where 300 families had built 12 years of community before being given 48 hours to leave it behind. Someone had already placed a temporary marker. I did not learn until later that it had been Carol Finch's idea, planned months in advance, carried in her personal kit on the landing transport. A simple metal post with a data plate, the names of the 12,000 people who had been displaced, the name of the settlement they had built, and at the bottom, one line that she had written herself. We came back. I stood at the forward view of my ship for a long time after Pete Larkin gave me the confirmation. I did not cry. I had thought I might, but what I felt was quieter than that. A slow, deep settling, like a weight that has been pressing down on you for so long you stopped noticing it, and then it lifts. And for a moment, you cannot quite remember what it felt like to breathe without it. Owen would have said something practical. He would have started talking about what the settlement needed, what systems would require repair, what the water recycling situation was like after 4 years of Keth occupation. He would have been right to do it. That was always the way with Owen. He looked at what needed doing next. I tried to do the same. There was a great deal left to do. In the years before the ignition, that is what the galactic record calls it now. The ignition. A name that came from a Keth political analyst writing in the immediate aftermath, and that humanity neither chose nor objected to. The conclave had produced an extensive library of assessments about the human species. I have read most of them in the years since. I have read them carefully, looking for the moment when they went wrong. The moment is not hard to find. It is the same moment in every document, It is the moment when the assessment reaches its conclusions about what humans would do, and every conclusion rests on the same foundation, the assumption that what humans had done in the past 40 years was what humans were. They watched us sign 14 accords. They concluded we were a signing species. That diplomacy was our natural mode, our preferred response, our deepest instinct. They were not entirely wrong. We did prefer diplomacy. We tried it extensively for 4 decades. But they failed to understand that a preference is not a limitation. And they failed to understand what happens to a preference when everything it produces is taken away. The conclave's lead strategist at the time was a Keth analyst named, in human transliteration, Saurith Van, considered one of the finest strategic minds in conclave service. His final assessment of humanity, submitted 2 weeks before the ignition, is a document I have spent considerable time with, because it is a nearly perfect record of how completely they had misunderstood us. He wrote that humans were a high-emotion, low-patience species whose decision cycles were too short for long-term strategic planning. He wrote that human political structures were too fractured to sustain coordinated action across multiple systems. He wrote that human history, which he had studied in detail, demonstrated a clear pattern of strong initial resistance followed by adaptation and integration. He cited the colonial periods of Earth's own history, the long occupations, the eventual compromises. He had read those correctly. He had drawn from them the wrong conclusion. He thought those histories were evidence of human weakness. They were actually evidence of something else, that humans had lived inside subjugation before, from the inside. And they knew exactly how it worked. And they had spent 4 decades recognizing the pattern, because they had seen it before, just with different names on the documents and different faces on the other side of the table. The conclave had treated history as a predictor. They had not understood that for humanity, history is also a manual. There is a specific misunderstanding that I return to most often when I think about those years. It concerns what the conclave chose to monitor and what they chose to overlook. Their inspection programs were thorough where they expected threats. They watched human fleet numbers, counted warships, audited weapons manifests, tracked military officer movements. They were meticulous about the things that looked like danger. They never counted the engineers. They had files on admirals. They did not have files on the maintenance crews who spent 15 years modifying equipment in ways that would not appear threatening until the morning when it mattered. They had assessments of Earth's political leadership. They had no assessment of the colony administrator on Varith 4, who quietly rerouted construction supply chains for a decade to keep ember caches stocked. They had detailed models of the human military. They had no model of the civilian population that had made a collective, unspoken decision to prepare for a future their government was afraid to acknowledge. This is the thing that the conclave never managed to compute, that the most dangerous capability a species can possess is not the one held by its military. It is the one distributed through its ordinary people who wake up in the morning and do their work and come home at night and live their lives, and carry in the back of their minds a clear understanding of what is at stake, a quiet, persistent commitment to not let it be taken. The Keth had a file on humanity. They had filled it with what they could measure. They had left out everything that mattered. The war lasted 9 months. I have heard people use larger words for it, more dramatic framings, the kind of language that turns events into monuments. I prefer accuracy. It lasted 9 months. The Keth Dominion fractured along internal lines that had existed for decades and that the campaign had simply accelerated. 3 of the 6 conclave species withdrew from the organization within 6 months of the ignition, not because humanity forced them, but because the release of the fold drive schematics had made the conclave's value proposition collapse, and species that had been members out of practical necessity, rather than ideological commitment, saw no reason to remain. Roy Hatch released those schematics 3 weeks into the campaign. 40 years of research developed quietly and separately from the official joint programs that the conclave monitored. Not the same as conclave fold technology. Different in some ways, better in some ways, simply different in others. Complete technical specifications, manufacturing tolerances, software architecture, material requirements, released freely on every frequency that reached non-conclave species. No restrictions, no requirements attached. The conclave had maintained its monopoly on fold drive technology for 200 years. That monopoly was the foundation of its economic architecture. Species that could not fold could not trade efficiently. Species that could not trade efficiently needed the conclave's established networks. Species that needed those networks could not afford to challenge conclave authority, a system that had sustained itself for 2 centuries, by ensuring that no one outside it had the tools to build outside it. Roy Hatch ended that in about 47 minutes. Within 3 weeks, 14 non-conclave species had begun construction programs. Within 3 months, the first non-conclave fold-capable vessel launched from a shipyard that had never previously produced anything capable of traveling faster than conventional lightspeed drives allowed. Within 6 months, the trade route map of the galaxy was being redrawn by people who had never had the tools to draw it before. We had not just challenged the conclave, we had removed the mechanism by which it held everything together. The conclave as a governing body ceased functioning in the 9th month. There was no formal dissolution, no ceremony. It simply stopped being able to do anything, because the architecture that had sustained it was gone, and the species that had depended on it had found other arrangements. Humanity called a halt, stated its terms, waited. The tribunal was held in a building I had visited once before as a much younger officer, for a ceremony that I now remember only dimly. An Earth government building, real stone, real gravity, real weather outside the windows. I appreciated the weather. I had spent enough time in controlled atmosphere stations that actual rain felt like a luxury. The senators who questioned me were not hostile, for the most part. They were people trying to understand something large through the lens of their institutions, which are built for smaller things. They had legitimate concerns. Protocol Ember had operated outside official governmental authorization for 4 decades. Decisions that affected billions of people had been made by a group of 12 officers in a room 41 years ago, and the chain of consequence from those decisions ran directly to 9 months of active multi-system operations that had reshaped the galaxy. These were real questions. I sat with them. Senator Colin Webb led the session. Thorough, fair, visibly uncomfortable with the thing he was being asked to judge, not because he lacked courage, but because he understood, I think, that the categories his institutional framework provided were not quite the right shape for what had actually happened. He asked me whether I believed Protocol Ember had been legal under Earth's charter and Joint Command mandate. I told him honestly that it had existed in a space that the charter had not anticipated, and I did not think legal or illegal were the correct categories for a 41-year contingency built by people who could see the ceiling approaching and made a choice about what to do before they hit it. He asked whether I believed the ignition had been necessary. I looked at him for a moment. Then I asked him, where were the voices in this chamber when the 14th Accord was signed, when the 12th colony was relocated, when Varith 4 was cleared and 12,000 people were given 48 hours, and my brother died in the back of a transport, because the company that killed him paid a fine worth less than the part that would have prevented it. The room was quiet. I did not say it with anger. I had moved past the kind of anger that needs volume. I said it the way you say something that has been true for a long time and no longer needs to be defended. Senator Webb looked at his hands. Then he looked up. "Thank you, Commander," he said. "We'll take a recess." They never resumed the session on those terms. 3 weeks later, the tribunal issued a report that I have read several times. I find it honestly unsatisfying in its careful language, and genuinely satisfying in its conclusions, which were essentially that what had happened was too large for the existing frameworks to process neatly, and that the more useful question was what came next. What came next was the thing I had spent the most time thinking about in the months between the ceasefire and the tribunal. Ned had said it to me very early, in that maintenance bay. The goal had never been to replace the conclave with something worse. Carol Finch had said it differently. She did not want the marker on Varith 4 to be the first post in a row of conquered territories. She wanted it to be a marker for what had been lost and reclaimed, not the first item in a new catalog of things taken from someone else. Roy Hatch, who said very little about anything that was not technical, had said it most simply: "We are not the Keth." The charter for the new Galactic Assembly emerged from 3 months of genuine, difficult, fractious negotiation involving 37 species. It was not primarily a human document. Humanity proposed the framework and insisted on certain non-negotiable elements: equal standing for every species, no monopolies on fundamental technologies, clear and enforceable protections for colonial populations. Beyond those elements, we sat at the table the same as everyone else. That was, as it turned out, the thing that surprised the galaxy most. Not the fleet, not the fold drive release, not the precision of the ignition. The thing that surprised them most was that when it was over, we sat down. The Arathi signed the charter first. It was not a gesture I had expected. When their ambassador made the announcement, my first reaction was suspicion, a habit that 3 years of careful diplomacy was slowly working out of me. But the reasoning was transparent enough. They had been bystanders. They knew it. Signing first was the most visible thing they could do to put distance between themselves and that history. Ambassador Eighth Soul sent me a private message the morning they signed. 4 words. We should have spoken. I kept it. Out of everything in 3 years of communications, that is the one I kept. It is not an apology large enough for what happened. It does not reach back to Varith 4 or the Ninth Accord or the 48-hour notices or the fine worth less than a replacement part. Nothing could reach back that far and close the distance. I know that. She knew that when she wrote it. But it is something, and I have learned in the years since that something spoken honestly is worth more than the most precise silence. I went to Varith 4 in the spring of the 2nd year after the ceasefire. The resettlement program was ongoing. Not all 12,000 displaced people had chosen to return. The settlement itself needed rebuilding from the foundation up because 4 years of relay station operation had changed the land, and the infrastructure required starting over in places. Carol Finch was coordinating it. She had requested and received an official assignment to the project, which meant leaving her position in the Joint Command Logistics Division and taking a civilian role on the surface. She had done it without hesitation. The marker was still there. She had replaced the temporary post with a permanent one. Same design, same data plate, same single line at the bottom. We came back. Around it, the settlement was growing again. Slowly, imperfectly. The way things grow when they are being built by real people with real limitations, rather than by a plan that has not met the ground yet. I walked through it in the early morning before the work crews started and before the children woke up. Quiet. The way places under construction are quiet. A held breath kind of quiet, full of potential rather than emptiness. I found Carol at the edge of the new water recycling station. She was looking at a set of plans and drinking coffee. She did not look up when I approached, because she had heard my steps and already knew who it was. The processor is going to be undersized by spring, she said. We need a second unit. Write it up, I said. I'll sign it. She nodded. She kept looking at the plans. We stood there for a while without talking. Around us, the settlement was waking up slowly. Lights coming on in temporary structures. The sounds of early risers starting their days. Somewhere to the east, a child's voice asking something I could not make out. Owen would have hated the processor placement, she said eventually. Wrong side of the slope for drainage. She had never met Owen. She had read about him, the way she had read about all 12,000 of them, through displacement records and files. And Carol Finch had a memory for the people in her records that went well beyond what the job required. He would have fixed it, I said. We'll fix it, she said. We'll fix all of it. I believed her. In the afternoon, I sat for a while near the marker. A child came and looked at it, a girl about 7 years old, the focused curiosity of children who have not yet learned to walk past things that interest them. She read the plate slowly, moving her lips over the names. There were 12,000 of them. It took her a long time. When she had gone through it all, she looked up at me. "Is your name on it?" she asked. "No," I said. "My brother's is." She looked back at the plate. "Which one?" I showed her. She nodded very seriously, the way children nod when they have absorbed something they intend to think about for a long time. Then she ran off toward the sound of other children somewhere in the new streets. I sat there until the light changed. I thought about Gareth's soul in the Cascara chamber, watching a sign with the expression of a landlord collecting overdue rent. I thought about the duty officer on the Keth inspection fleet saying, "Stand down," in a tone that assumed compliance, the way the sun assumes orbit. I thought about the conclave session feed and Sarith Van's assessment, and the line that said humans did not act, they negotiated. I thought about Owen's hand, steady in the dark of a failing transport, carrying people he did not know toward air they could breathe. We had never, in all the long and difficult history of our species, permanently stayed down. We had been knocked down. We had stayed down for periods that had felt permanent, that had been designed to feel permanent, that had sometimes succeeded in feeling permanent for generations, before something shifted and we began the long work of standing up again. They had read our history, they had seen this, they had cataloged every fall. They had simply stopped reading before the part where we got back up. That was their mistake, not the Varith 4 order, or the Cascara Accords, or the inspection fleet, or the observer plan. Those were the triggers. The mistake was older than any of that. The mistake was looking at a species that had survived everything it had ever faced: disease, scarcity, conflict, collapse, the long dark of a dozen near ends, and concluding that because we could be pushed, we had no limit. Every species has a limit. Ours took 41 years to find. They should have read further. The girl who read the names came back at dusk with 2 other children who wanted to know what the marker said. I stayed while she explained it to them, in the way of children explaining things to other children, imprecisely, earnestly, with complete confidence in the importance of what she was conveying. When they had all gone in for the evening, I stood for a moment in the cooling air and looked at the marker in the last of the light. We came back. Yes, we did. And we were not going anywhere again.